I have a handout at the end, so I won't forget. There are two parts to this paper, and I have time for one part today. The first part is called Feral Scholarship and a Theta Point. Feral in the sense of a feral cat. Okay? And actually, it's not an original term. It's an established term. So I'll start with a couple of haikus. In the dark harbor, midst swirling silent echoes, all ships set their sails. This is in the handout. And seek this is by Matsuo Basho. Seek not to follow in the footsteps of the wise, but seek what they sought. The first part of the paper is kind of a general introduction to the idea of mind-body, relying heavily on Dale's interpretation in Wikipedia and on Wally's major treatment of it. So I'm, given where we are in the conference, I'm going to skip over most of that. But I want to, just as a footnote so I don't forget, in terms of post-critical, I think Encyclopedia Britannica is critical, and Wikipedia is post-critical. We talked about that.
Interesting.
So I'll start out with Wally's circular analogy, moving from circumference to center. Although Poteat's mind-body takes in the entire range of the experience of every sentient being dynamically in coitus with the world, it has certain properties of special interest to me that Wally cites in reference to his organizing paradigm, a circle whose center is mind-body's source point and whose circumference is its boundary with the world. In setting up that analogy, Wally does not at all minimize the vital interaction between self and world that maintains the tonicity of the mind-body, meaning the balance of forces that forms and maintains its homeostatic integrity. In the same way that the fluids on the inside and the outside of a microorganism must be balanced for the organism to function and maintain its structure. Cue the thunder. The properties that Mead elicits from his center radius circumference paradigm that interest me begin at the center. That was not Poteat's primary interest. Like the philosophical figures with whom he was engaged, especially Polanyi and Merleau-Ponty, his interest starts from the phenomenal experience, meaning the sensory experience of the world, and moves logically toward its source, and then considers how the origins of mind-body structure, how the origins of mind-body structure that experience. David Rutledge parallels this conceptual arc in his description, moving from phenomenal experience into its pre-articulable source, where he says, the ground of the human notions of order, measure, connectedness, hanging together, that is logic, lies in this pre-lingual level of awareness, which is inescapably ours, which never leaves us, and from which all the articulations of higher thought are educed. So again, starting from out and coming toward the center. Similarly, Dale, in his Wikipedia article, moves in that same outward to inward direction. When he says, another of Poteat's significant ideas is that all explicitly formal modes of rationality, logic, mathematics, geometry, computer processing, and all the wonderfully useful things with which they endow us in our technocratic world are ultimately rooted and grounded in the pre-reflectively lived flesh of our mind bodies in the world. So I want to focus on that center, but before enumerating those central properties at the source of mind-body that Wally identifies, I want to note two essentials, what I consider two essentials. The first essential is that mind-body, as Poteat held it, can only be understood in its full range of applicability, that is, that it applies to all sentient beings, arguably meaning all living things with any sort of experience whatsoever. If so, then the properties of its source must be identical for all beings, ergo even prior to sentience itself, which Dale pointed out. And in fact, even prior to phenomenal experience, requiring any sort of perceptual instrumentality, because you're prior to that instrumentality. Consequently, to consider the self-reality designated by the term mind-body necessarily transcends the limits of phenomenology, which generally has rather little to say about the ultimate source of the self-reality, and not much more to say about the very most primordial root of experience that in fact precedes experience in the sense we usually mean by that word. At this point, we are yet a long way from reflection. We are at a point that is not even pre-reflective, which implies a precursor whose structure is telic to reflection, roots to it. And also, consequently, anything said about mind-body must be examined to ensure that it applies to all living beings, even in their pre-sentient states. Statements about mind-body that do not do so must make explicit their limited applicability to higher sentient beings or just to humans. Otherwise, it will be natural to project the meaning of mind-body from our own experience, creating a literally toxic duality between humans and other sentient beings that is precisely Cartesian and that is not at all supported by the idea of mind-body at its most primordial manifestation. The second essential that I want to point out is that the path Poteat chose to go down that resulted in his idea of mind-body is only one of many paths he could have chosen. And the logic that compelled him to choose the path he did choose has compelled others to explore that same region, if not the identical path. As proof of that point, I cite three examples. Three examples of choosing that path, but not exactly the same path. For the first example, I noticed that in Wikipedia, there is not yet an article on mind-body. But there is an article on body-mind. And it begins, body-mind is a compound of body and mind developed during the second half of the 20th century by researchers in the field of humanistic psychology and picked up by anti-dualist adherents to New Age spirituality. The intention has been to move beyond the dualist conceptions of body and mind towards a unified and interrelated concept of a body-mind. The term is related to the older concepts psychosomatic and somatopsychic, and I have now added to the Wikipedia article by saying, and overlaps in significant ways with the term mind-body developed independently by American philosopher William H. Poteat in the last several decades of the 20th century. By the way, there is also an article on post-critical and no article on critical realism. Unbelievable, huh?
I'll bet it's a major section of some other articles. It's just not independently flagged.
I think we should just take our post-critical article and just put "not" in front of everything. Anyway, so that shows a common enterprise. It's clear from the balance of the article that those familiar with the presumably more popular body-mind are unfamiliar with Poteat's mind-body, and the reverse is generally true. Comparing the two Wikipedia articles mentioned thus far suggests how much richer and more compelling logically and phenomenologically is Poteat's mind-body idea compared to the idea of body-mind, which seems only to create a label and a therapeutic approach intending to counter Cartesian dualism without achieving Poteat's deep understanding of how such a thing would necessarily operate in the dynamic interplay of self and world. For the second example of that parallel path, I have in mind the considerable body of work in especially Eastern mystical literature dating back many centuries, having to do with consciousness and its ultimate source, what in Polanyian terms I would call the ultimate from, in the from via to formulation. Where is the ultimate from? How far back? Whereas the Western approach, including Polanyi and Merleau-Ponty, has its primary focus on the self-world interface, the outermost circumference of the mind-body circle that Wally draws, and from that perspective looks back toward the experiential source and center, the Eastern approach starts at the opposite perspective, at the center of the Mead circle, originating in the ineffable, non-intentional, contentless consciousness accessible to those who master the arts of deep meditation to a degree that enables them to explore it as a kind of non-conceptual landscape, as numinauts, if you will. That state is so different, even incommensurate with normal waking consciousness, that it is almost entirely beyond the ken of Western philosophy, just as dark matter has been entirely beyond the ken of physics until quite recently. And the phrase is, those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. Because normal waking conceptuality as we know it is constrained by phenomenal experience, beginning with the constraints of identifying entirely with the physical body. Nonetheless, anyone who treads on the path that yields concepts, such as mind-body or body-mind, is walking alongside those Eastern sages, and sometimes in their footsteps. For the third example of parallel explorations and findings, I can mention aspects of my own intellectual biography. Beginning in my undergraduate career at Duke, in a course taught by Poteat, I set out on an intellectual path that turned out to be partly parallel to Poteat's, except that I made a decision, unlike him, to follow that path in what technologists call a clean room model. That is, without participating in the philosophical conversation that so absorbed Poteat, and instead making use of decidedly non-academic approaches to first-person exploration of consciousness and reality, including one notable medical experiment I'm about to describe. My purpose in doing that has been to discover if an approach relatively independent from the conversation that so engaged those immersed in academia might produce anything original and worthwhile, imposed by his deep scholarly background and ingrained academic commitments. Thanks to Sam Mann, I'm informed that sometime in the early 1990s, in the description of manuscript for his proposal to the publisher of Recovering the Ground, he did explain, I have tried to write as if I had no other text than myself as a creature of this culture. To do this, I had to travel light, disburdened of the scholarship that is itself a creature of the culture that I wished to see through. So he unlearned what I avoided learning. I also had to be highly skeptical of the conceptual seductions of my native language, while remaining singularly alert to the riches it contains for conducting me back to my radical self before the fall. How, defined by these premises, do reflection, criticism, world, imagination, value, interpretation, thinking, speaking, time, hope, and memory begin to look? Speaking for myself, 30 years later, I attempted to rejoin that conversation during my graduate studies at Yale. I was recently surprised to find that some of my findings about the source from which experience emerges coincide with some of Poteat's in regard to the properties of the source of mind-bodily being, after having already found an interplay with certain mystical ideas about that same source. In citing this personal example, my intent is not to propose that Poteat's and my findings are identical, or that his or mine are warranted by established mystical ideas, but rather to consider whether there may be some interesting correspondences emerging from the common methodology of post-critical first-person inquiry between Poteat's findings and my own in regard to the mind-bodily source. And between those and what I regard as a commensurate Eastern mystical account of the construction of reality and its nexus with experience. I'm especially interested not in how they diverge or contrast, but in how each may gain something from the others, however little. A core principle of mystical teaching meant to express the paradoxical nature of trying to articulate the inarticulable, I've already mentioned. One who knows doesn't speak, one who speaks doesn't know. Just as Wally's circumference defines a boundary between mind-bodily being and world, this boundary between one who knows and one who speaks demarcates the ineffable from the explicable, and even the inconceivable from the conceivable. A zone, the inconceivable, in which realities can be expressed only elliptically, as Poteat attempted to demonstrate, through indirection and triangulation. There is a sort of knowledge that is ineffable in the sense that it cannot be converted into phenomenally based concepts at all, because it is not like anything perceptible via the physical senses. So it's like beyond tacit in a way. Those who do not experience that know not whereof they try to speak, which is the meaning of that aphorism. That boundary stands as a great intellectual and spiritual challenge. The challenge is to press against that boundary and stretch its limits, to encroach on the territory just beyond conceptuality itself, and to do so in a way that makes it possible to bring and retain some impressions from the other side of that boundary, sufficient to be articulable in intelligible concepts, with sufficient clarity that those who know but do not realize yet that they know can recognize it, and those who do not know can learn something of what it is that they do not know. The methodology for conducting that sort of exploration is sometimes called first-person inquiry. There was another term earlier in the day, which I wrote down, but reflective philosophy.
Reflexive.
It's reflexive. Ah, okay, thank you.
Reflexive phenomenon.
From France.
From France. Maybe that was the thing. Yeah, it was in connection with Marcel. So it was reflective philosophy.
It was. I like the other one too.
Excuse me.
First-person inquiry, that term is intended to differentiate it from empirical research, which investigates things in the third person within the reductive constraints of objectivity, and in the second person via depersonalized surveys and interviews, which is the objectivizing of subjectivity, turning fragmentary personal narratives, stories, into anonymous metadata. In first-person inquiry, the investigator's own consciousness is the subject, and the investigation is personal but not subjective, to the extent that subjective elements are bracketed, set aside as the investigation proceeds. Although it can resemble meditation, its methodology is different in that its intention is not prescriptive.